Welcome to this web lecture, the Emotionally Corrective Classroom. Exploring trauma-informed strategies to support students' mental health needs. I'm Michelle Paul, a psychologist at UNLV and the Workday Endowed Executive Director of UNLV Practice. Founded in 2012, UNLV Practice, or Partnership for Research, Assessment, Counseling, Therapy, and Innovative Clinical Education, is a community mental health clinic where students who are working towards their master's and doctoral degrees in counseling and psychology provide sliding scale therapy and assessment services under faculty supervision. Perhaps you won't find it too surprising that Nevada unfortunately ranks 51st nationally for access to quality mental health, despite a great need for these services. Our clinic's mission is to tackle this mental health crisis by providing access to high quality mental and behavioral health care today while preparing the next generation workforce to serve tomorrow. Today, I'm very pleased to introduce our youth services team, Dr. Roberta Miranda, Dr. Sarah Ramos, and Professor Diana Urena. This team has been focusing their efforts on developing resources and programming to not only serve in our clinic the kids and families who've experienced trauma, but also to collaborate with educators to create classroom environments that provide the safety, nurturance, protection, and acceptance needed for exploration and learning despite trauma. They've prepared a talk that will offer you both general principles that will guide you in creating that emotionally corrective classroom space, but also as many practical tips as they can pack into 90 minutes. I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Roberta Miranda, who will take it from here.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Paul. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to be starting off presenting our learning objectives and covering our first section. And this is what we planned for today. We're going to begin by doing a bit of a quick review of common trauma responses in children. We're also going to spend some time talking a little bit about what trauma is and some terminology related to trauma. Then we're going to transition into understanding what trauma-informed care is and some of those tenets. And then we're going to wrap up by talking about creating an emotional corrective classroom. Our goal is really to present information that you hopefully can immediately apply into your professional work. So let's talk a little bit about trauma. How common is trauma? And I didn't want to just throw a lot of statistics, because most of us really recognize the prevalence, but there were a couple of statistics that really did stick out to me when it made me think of the work that we do with our youth. Approximately 2/3 of children in the United States experience a trauma before their 18th birthday. So again, when we think about the prevalence of that, that's pretty high when we think of who's in our classrooms. And these statistics are taken from St. John's University and one of their projects. Approximately 1/3 of children experience 2 or more types of trauma. And rates are higher for African American, Latino, Latinx, and Native, as well than Asian and Caucasian populations. So let's talk specifically about common trauma responses in children. And so when we think of trauma, some of these responses may or may not be as surprising. And most of you working with children will recognize some of these types of behaviors. We might see children who participate in more regressive behavior. We might see some anger and aggression, sometimes that avoidance and social withdrawal, that inability to concentrate or focus. Depression and irritability is a common symptom or side effect of trauma. Constant worrying or fears. We see a lot of children demonstrate physical complaints. So the tummy aches, the headaches, the nausea, the I don't feel good is often could be an indicator of trauma. And then we also see some of the emotional responses, such as the self-blame and just some of the internalized feelings related to the trauma. And so when we're going over just some responses, just a quick aside is just to remember that not all children who experience a traumatic event will necessarily develop a traumatic response. So some of that just may have to do with already, just corresponding events and resiliency and just some other factors. So we were identifying some pretty common responses in children. But really in thinking about the classroom, thinking about how that might appear in the youth, your elementary school, your high school students or scholars, and seeing how that might present in the classroom. So as an educator, you look at your classroom, and chances are might see different types of behaviors. So we often automatically think of perhaps some of the aggressive behaviors as being the ones that could signify perhaps some trauma exposure. Next slide. What might be surprising, though, is oftentimes it's some of those less physical, the less external types of behaviors that can also signify trauma. So when we think about, again, imagining scanning our classroom and looking at each of the students, that it may not be that child that's throwing a paper airplane or being aggressive. It could be a student that maybe is just a little fearful, a little anxious. Working with some of our younger students, sometimes seeing that separation anxiety. So when we're seeing crying at drop off during school days or clinginess to the parents before going back into the classroom. And this is not to say this is an automatic indicator, but these just might just clue us into there's perhaps maybe something that could be related to a traumatic event. Not eating, this might not be something that we see, very explicitly, but if we see the student in the cafeteria, maybe picking at their food or just throwing away their whole lunch bags, it might be, again, giving some awareness to these behaviors. And the reason, too, we're presenting this is just to maybe to develop a more insightful eye or awareness, kind of cluing into the students who might need that extra support. So creating perhaps like a cultural awareness amongst all the students to maybe indicate who might need that, just like a conversation or just a check-in. So that's something to keep in mind when I'm going through this list. So maybe you're thinking already of a student that you've noticed hasn't been eating or a little quieter. That might just warrant just a quick check-in, and at most. And that's part of the reason that we're presenting some of this information to see how it translates into the work. Sometimes when we see non-engagement in classroom activities, not wanting to partake in group activities, perhaps, what we might perceive as resistant, might be an indicator of something else. Sometimes having accidents, those tummy aches or headaches. Sometimes those students that get a little startled, so that slamming of the door or the drawer, you'll notice just an alert reaction. Next. Fighting with other children. And believe it or not, even just daydreaming, just looking out the window, being disengaged with material. We certainly have those creative students, who might be thinking of their next story. But we might also have those students who are just really just disassociating from what might be going on. Not paying attention, sexualized behaviors, maybe some restlessness during creative time. Impulsivity and collaborating. So maybe students who just want to jump in there or grab the pencil or jump ahead or just notice a little bit more disruptive or impulsive playful behavior. Perhaps our students who just choose not to speak or just refuse to do things. So again, just making sure that we look at the external and the internal responses, because sometimes those quieter responses can be easy just to overlook. Okay. Thanks, Diana. And so when we think about trauma, we sometimes think of automatically, something pretty major. Like we might associate trauma with a natural disaster, for example, or a violent crime or a car accident. And certainly those are illustrations of trauma. But a term or a couple of terms to present to you today, and thinking about how this might tie into your work, is something that is identified as the big T and little t when it comes to trauma. So when we think about trauma, oftentimes when we think of a child, it often senses a violation of a sense of safety that interrupts their security, interrupts their little safe haven, in a sense. So we assign the idea of a big T trauma to some of those deeply disturbing, perhaps life-threatening events or situations, like the violent crimes or the natural disasters. So those we'd identify as big T traumas. Chronic big T trauma is often the result of repeated and ongoing trauma, perhaps domestic abuse in the home or other types of abuse. So it's not necessarily just one event, a series of big events or ongoing events. And then we often use, the term PTSD is thrown in the mix when it comes to trauma. And not getting too much into our DSM-5 criteria, being mindful that for a trauma to be considered PTSD, or for somebody to have met the criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder, that some of those symptoms that we discussed, plus more, must have more than a month and be severe enough to interfere with daily functioning. Okay. So little t's, though, also has a violation of a sense of safety and interrupts the child's safe haven. So the little t's include events or situations that certainly can cause distress, fear, and a sense of helplessness. So a little T trauma might be, for example, the result of a romantic breakup. If they're especially if they're like a teenager. Think of the teenager who just broke up. And we could maybe perhaps smile, as adults looking back, but their world has been shattered. There's a high level of distress and fear, a sense of helplessness. As clinicians, we see that. Sometimes that warrants therapy. At times, it can be pretty difficult for the ego. And especially thinking about where the developmental stages are of the youth that we're working with. So oftentimes very emotionally driven. We also think of situations that might include bullying, where there might be a feeling of humiliation attached to it, of helplessness, of I don't belong. Those feelings can be internalized and also cause those feelings of distress. Ongoing microaggressions, so if we're thinking of maybe some cultural diversity issues and we're dealing with our clientele, our students of color, and there's ongoing experience of microaggressions, that would be considered a little t, because again, affects that sense of safety, can cause some ongoing distress, fear, certain view of the world, in a sense. Even financial distress. Sometimes we attach financial distress to the parents. If we see our students wearing the same clothes every day, if we see them perhaps looking like they haven't bathed regularly, they don't have perhaps as much access to some of the daily basic need resources, that can be certainly stressful and really affect sense of self. So imagine a child, perhaps, yes, who's gone through a big T, but also imagine the students that might be going through series of little t traumatic events. These can very much also affect parts of the brain. That could be, those trauma-induced changes could result in varying degrees of impairment. So these ongoing little t's, even just one or two little t's, we can recognize that there could be an impact. So when it comes to trauma-induced changes, we can see that where there's research that supports that it could lead to varying degrees of cognitive impairment. So could result in some learning disabilities, maybe the difficulty of retaining information as our students aren't focused, distracted. They may not be sleeping well. That's a big one. Whether it's due to circumstances or due to the I'm worrying, I'm distressed, I'm not sleeping well. Well, we know sleep is related to focus is related to learning. So we can see that there's all these contributing pieces to that could result in the behavior that we see in the classroom. We can see that also that affects emotional dysregulation. So sometimes when we see that impulsivity or we see that shyness, we might be seeing a student that hasn't developed that part of the brain that helps them remain emotionally regulated, or they haven't been able to tap into those mechanisms that help them self-regulate. And that results into some of those other behaviors in the classroom. So we can see that there could very well be a relationship between either the big T or the little t's, and some of the feelings and the emotions and the cognitive abilities, which of course tie into the behaviors. And just to revisit the small t's, and again, because this isn't quite as presented quite as often, in some of our other Trauma 101 perhaps presentations, but to really recognize its importance, because these little t's, really, when we as a group talked about this, really does tie into that individual, that student really feeling left with that feeling of notable helplessness, perhaps shame and humiliation. That really is, that does sometimes lead into some of those behaviors that we've talked about. Okay. So talking about trauma-informed care. So recognizing we've got our big T's, our little T's, we might see some of those behaviors, as educators and part of the school culture. There's certainly not a discussion to say, well, that means every educator, every administrator should be trained as a counselor, because we all know that you have so much already on your plate, and so that certainly would not be reasonable to ask so much, for the educators. But what this conversation really includes, and what Professor Inya and Dr. Ramos will continue to present to you, is just really the concept of a trauma-informed care culture. So, and part of that is just shifting, just a mind shift of perhaps just even recognizing trauma, seeing that if a behavior is perhaps disruptive in a class or frustrating, to automatically not consider or maybe think, that the child is purposely trying to be annoying, or that the student is it's going to be hard to reach them, or oh no, Johnny's in class again. Instead of thinking like, what's wrong with this student, is to shift that mindset to consider perhaps what has happened to the student that maybe has led to that behavior. Perhaps just recognizing and acknowledging, the role that trauma may have played in the student's life and could be leading to some of these behaviors. Recognizing how trauma can be treated. So if I'm seeing that the same student is not eating, perhaps isolating, withdrawing, it might be a clue to me that there could be some sort of intervention. And maybe that intervention is just a referral to the school counselor, or maybe just checking in with the student. Or maybe this is an opportunity to connect with the student's parent and connect them to clinical services. So really just creating an awareness and hopefully an organizational culture to really emphasize and respect and responding to effects of trauma at all levels. And having these conversations, not avoiding it and saying, well, that's not in my lane. My lane is just to teach. It's like, well, gosh, in order to hopefully have a more harmonious classroom, maybe by creating an organizational culture, that shifts gears and sees where there could be that extra support could yield into hopefully just a more enjoyable classroom experience. And then, of course, too, this really informs us and informs you and your roles to avoid re-traumatization. So if there's already a feeling of humiliation among the student, or there's a feeling of unsafety, that we do everything that we can do to avoid that student not feeling safe, or to avoid feeling re-traumatized, to create as much of a safe and secure classroom environment that we can. So just to take one quick moment, since you've heard my voice here for 20 minutes, is just do a really quick reflective exercise. And this is really cool because when we've done it together, it taps into, wow, what was it like to be a student again? So if I could please ask us all to just think for a moment, scan our memories about who was your favorite teacher. Maybe doing a quick scan of like kindergarten, first grade, elementary school, high school. And chances are, as you think about each grade, there's one teacher that stands out. It's like, oh my gosh, I remember Mr. Douglas. Mr. Douglas for me in fifth grade. I stop at fifth grade. I remember him. I have fond memories of Mr. Douglas. And then in thinking about our favorite teacher, whatever grade we were in, is to just take a moment to think about what was it about this teacher, perhaps their characteristics, perhaps your experience with this teacher, your feelings around this teacher, and to really examine what was it about this experience that made or really inspired this teacher to be one of your favorites or your top teachers. And in doing this exercise for myself earlier, I was thinking, what was it about Mr. Douglas that I really stopped and smiled about? And for me, I was just thinking he made me feel seen. He recognized I was a shy student, and he would take the time to specifically point out something positive, use affirmations to just recognize me. I felt safe. I felt special. We can move on, Diana. And so thinking about that, so when we think, wow, that person really, here I am, almost 50 years old, and I could still remember that experience with Mr. Douglas in the fifth grade. And so that's something that you can do, as an educator. It's not necessarily pull out your therapy chops and do a therapy session, but just connect to perhaps tap into that empathy. Not sympathy, recognize, what might be going on with the student. Maybe just noticing them so they, like Mr. Douglas, let them to make me feel less invisible, in the classroom, to be noticed. To develop relationships, to create a comprehensive approach. So developing relationships with the students, perhaps with other teachers who interact with the students, with the school counselor, to create a comprehensive team approach with the students so it doesn't all fall on one person's lap. to be that source of resiliency. So positivity, someone can come to you when they need something. And just remember, this is something that I take from Brene Brown, I borrow from Brene Brown, is that sometimes we feel the pressure to always have to say the right thing. And really, empathy is just being present with someone and being authentic. So just sitting there and saying, yeah, man, that's a tough situation. That in itself can be impactful. And, if you're able to become familiar with community resources, recognize it's okay to lean on other helpers so it doesn't all fall in your lap. And just like for Mr. Douglas was for me, it's just remembering that one adult can make a difference. I think I have one more slide. And then just to take away as I wrap up my section is the idea, I love this term, of emotional attunement. And it's not to say we have to be attuned to every, number of 40 students in our class to be attuned to each and every single one, but just have that ability to be emotionally attuned, to be aware, to be present to children's emotional needs. Because a lot of the children, they're wired to act before they think. Sometimes we do the knee-jerk reaction to the behavior. But whatever we can do to create a psychological safety in the classroom can help increase that student engagement and hopefully just really help you become more attuned to your students. So I think now we are going to transition to the next section.
Thank you so much, Dr. Miranda. You did a really good job at giving us a good recap about trauma and trauma responses and kind of planting the seed of why we should maintain that trauma-informed care lens. And so I'm going to be talking to you about the tenets of trauma-informed care. And one way that I like to sometimes refer to trauma-informed care is to think about it as like the glasses that you're putting on. So when you're in your classrooms, when you're in your school community, when you're with the children, when you're with the parents, it's having these glasses and having this lens of, again, that shift that Dr. Miranda talked about, the perspective of like the shift from what's wrong with this person or with the student or with this family to what has happened to this person. And so I'm going to go over each tenet and it'll help lay a nice foundation into some classroom strategies that Dr. Ramos is going to be talking about. One thing that I just want to score and like underscore and highlight is that this trauma-informed care lens really helps us look at behavior as a way of that child wanting to get their needs met, rather than, again, like looking at the child as like they're the bad child, or they're the child that gives us a hard time, or the child that isn't learning or isn't progressing. So again, as I'm talking about each tenet, I want you to kind of like take that and develop that as part of your lens. So the first tenet of trauma-informed care is safety. Safety refers literally to creating a safe space. When we talk about the spaces that we create, I'm not just talking about like the physical space. I'm also talking about the emotional space. And Dr. Miranda touched a little bit about on this, as we reflected on our favorite teachers and the importance of creating a safe haven. I want to remind you that trauma is a disruption in a child's or in a person's safe haven. And so the spaces that we create, both physically and emotionally, are highly important. And so how do you do that, right? How do you create safe physical and emotional space? It begins with you as adults. We are huge models for children, and actually children learn more by what they see than what we tell them to do. And so it's important that as adults, we're modeling things like respect, responsibility, we're modeling kindness, and that our spaces are comfortable and calming for the children. So more concretely, in the classroom, what does this look like? Look at your library. What are your books like? What's sitting on your shelf? Looking at or ensuring that the books that are in your library promote social emotional learning. This is really important because, Dr. Miranda talked about children are kind of wired to act before they think. Emotional intelligence is developmental. And so we as adults can serve as models to provide that emotional vocabulary and to model that appropriate emotional expression. And books are a great way to do that. Being mindful of our mood and our tone. How are you coming into your classroom space? Did you just have a really difficult commute and somebody cut you off and you're angry, right? What are you portraying to the children? So being mindful of not projecting those types of behaviors or emotions to the children. Again, checking your tone and modeling that calmness and kindness. Being mindful of language, right? Ensuring that we're not, when a child is having a difficult time in the classroom, that we're not being punitive or that we're labeling or being highly critical, because again, that's also modeling to other children in the classroom. A great strategy is also using feeling charts. This helps promote the use of articulating emotions. It helps normalize the expression and verbalization of emotions. And again, it helps with that development of emotional intelligence. Doing things on your day-to-day, like practicing a check-in and a check-out, giving the students a voice and creating that safety that you need during a check-in. You could say, oh, I had a rough night, or I'm tired, or I'm worried about this test. So promoting that among the classroom. Creating a space like a relaxation room or a corner. Sometimes your school might have a space that can be open to all students in the school, or you can even do that in your classroom as well. One thing that I want to reiterate, which Dr. Miranda talked about, is that having a trauma-informed care lens means that you're creating shift on all levels. So we all have an integral role in avoiding re-traumatization. And so again, you can also think about these strategies, not just in your classroom, but also in your school community. They can also extend beyond your classroom. The next tenet of trauma-informed care is trustworthiness and transparency. So this refers to essentially making and implementing decisions with the goals of building and maintaining trust between administration, staff, students, family, and the community. Again, this speaks to the point that I just made. Trauma-informed care transcends beyond the individual. It really takes the idea that it's a systemic approach. Children are part of systems, and everybody is empowered to be able to create these shifts. And so, this also means modeling that to the community, right? So if we're talking about having a school community, it means having that transparency between the families, right? With students, ensuring that expectations are clear, ensuring that as a school community, the expectations are also consistent and that there's a sense of structure. It also means that you are also maintaining boundaries within these systems, and that there's also just open and transparent communication. And again, these are kind of the foundations of trust. And kind of going back to that very basic definition of trauma, it's that interruption of the safe haven and that stripping of the trust. And so again, ensuring that the trustworthiness and transparency is demonstrated across all levels is important. Peer support, it refers to using shared lived experiences of survivors to promote safety, hope, and build collaboration. This really speaks to this idea of like, you're not alone. Often, you know, there's a lot of stigma in mental health, and, you know, some common trauma responses that Dr. Miranda shared are things like avoidance, right? Or refusal. I talked a little bit about emotional intelligence being developmental. Sometimes these students aren't, you know, survivors of trauma are not able to articulate what has happened, are not able to put into words, you know, what their experience is like, or those ripple effects of the trauma. And so, you know, promoting peer support, again, kind of builds on the idea of having a sense of trust, right? And so it just kind of promotes that safe haven. So what does that look like? It looks like just having peer supports in your community, ensuring that you're incorporating social emotional learning in your day-to-day, promoting self-care, not just for the students, right? Like when I talked about doing a check-in or a check-out, doing, you know, taking a collective deep breath, taking a moment, you know, to just sit in silence, but also ensuring that systemically that's also being promoted across all levels. So promoting staff wellness, right? In order for us to be the best versions of ourselves for the kiddos, like we have to take care of ourselves. You know, we have to kind of practice what we preach. And so again, having that systemic collaborative approach to promoting that wellness is key. And then also knowing your resources, and kind of what Dr. Miranda talked about, it's okay to lean on your community. It's okay to reach out for additional support. One thing that I want to point out is that you, in many ways, are a frontline. Teachers and educators are a frontline to children and adolescents, because you are the ones that they're spending at least 8 hours a day with. And so Dr. Miranda also touched on this. There's no expectation that you will also be experts in mental health counseling and in all the things. So it's okay to reach for to reach out to the community, to the professionals, and to make those referrals as needed. The next tenet of trauma-informed care is collaboration. And again, I think I've kind of touched upon this. Collaboration refers to the recognition that everyone has a role in creating a trauma-informed atmosphere. And, you know, like I said, children are part of a system. You yourself are part of a system, right? And all of these strategies that we have talked about, and, you know, we'll continue, Dr. Ramos will present some very specific classroom strategies, but these strategies can transcend beyond the classroom. And it's about coming together and working together. It's about uplifting each other and focusing on how everybody's strengths can help the child, rather than like engaging in power struggles. It's having a trauma-informed care refers to just having those strong working collaborative relationships, right? We hear the saying, it takes a village, right? You are part of that village. You know, considering things like forming or joining a trauma care team. And that just means maybe just being that one group at the school who promotes the collective deep breath at the beginning of each classroom day, or school day, or being the team that promotes those like spirit days at school, right? being part of the team that promotes the self-care, and the team that's also informed on where to make those appropriate and necessary resources. And again, identifying your community resources, right? Knowing when you need to refer out, and having that working collaborative relationship with your community partners as well. Trauma-informed care also talks about having empowerment and choice. It recognizes, this refers to recognizing the uniqueness and individual differences and encouraging the use of strengths while giving individuals choice and control. This is really, really important because children and adolescents, or anybody who has experienced trauma, they have been robbed of their space and choice, right? In many ways, they have lost control, right? It's that disruption in their safe haven. And so what trauma-informed care does, it's an effort to give that back to them, right? To give space and choice. And again, I talked about focusing on the strengths of how you of each person, of each part of the system, and how those strengths can help uplift the child, uplift the system, and rather than focusing on the power struggles. Well, empowerment and choice similarly also talks about like working together, right? And to continue to engage and that ongoing learning, that ongoing awareness of what trauma is, what's in the community, how children and the communities impacted by trauma. It also speaks to getting feedback, receiving feedback from your community, from your students, from each other, and identifying those opportunities for growth, right? And empowerment and choice also talks about not just at those systemic levels, but at the individual level, giving children or survivors of trauma space and choice and who they can confide in, right? How much do they want to share? What do they want to share? It's not about saying, tell me your story, I want to know what happened to you. It's about, what do I need to do to help you? Who do I connect you with? And more importantly, it's about reframing from the one-size-fits-all approach. One thing that Dr. Miranda talked about is she talked about these common trauma responses in children, but also, discuss the importance of differentiating between, like, there's externalizing behaviors, there's internalizing behaviors. And again, just because a child or an adolescent has experienced trauma doesn't mean they're going to have a traumatic response. So even, empowerment and choice, encourages you to step away from the idea that, like, just because they've had trauma, they're going to be X, Y, and Z, right? It's not a one size fits all approach in regard to response, in response to trauma, or in response to treatment. Humility and responsiveness. This refers to recognizing and addressing biases based on racial, ethnic, and cultural differences. This is really, really important. I think it talks to having that growth mindset in regard to what I was speaking about earlier. In that we have a responsibility to stay informed, to continue with that professional development, right? To continue to learn about your community and who your community partners are. But also it's about having awareness to what are your own biases, right? What have we been kind of socialized to believe about trauma or about stigma or about certain populations in response to trauma? And ensuring that, again, while maintaining that growth mindset, that we are, engaging in that ongoing professional development, that we're staying informed, that we're checking our own biases, as that will impact how we respond to children, to each other, to the system. It means being aware of what our resources are, right? Check your libraries again. What are you reading? Where are you getting your information? Who's educating you? And it's about being an ally and an advocate for trauma survivors.
All right, thank you. So Dr. Miranda gave us a really good description of just what is trauma, right? What that can look like in our students. And Professor Edina walked us through these pillars of trauma-informed care. And so the last part of this presentation, we're gonna take it deeper into what does this look like in the classroom, right? So we're going to talk about some specific classroom management strategies that we can apply to begin to be more trauma informed and create some of that emotionally corrective interventions in our classroom settings. So next slide. All right, so before we jump into this, I want to emphasize that in order to create this emotionally corrective or this trauma-informed classroom, something we want educators to keep in mind is that you're the expert in your classroom, right? You can go to trainings, you can go to read textbooks, attend webinars, attend workshops on trauma, on how to apply trauma-informed principles in your classroom. But at the end of the day, you're the one in your classroom, you're the one interacting with your students, you're the one who knows the nuances and the uniqueness of your specific classroom. And so we do encourage that, whatever recommendations we provide today, that you keep in mind that you're still the expert, right? And you can tweak, you can adapt, you can adjust to make this fit your classroom, to make this fit your specific students and your specific school and your specific community. Also, keeping in mind, as was previously mentioned, the importance of modeling healthy emotional reactions and modeling healthy problem solving throughout trauma-informed care, right? Throughout providing an emotionally corrective classroom. Our students and our kids are looking at adults to model how to react, in distressing situations, how to solve a problem when it comes up. And so it's really important as educators to keep in mind that it's not just about the the techniques that we use in the classroom, but it's also how as a person we're showing up in that classroom. And so keeping in mind that taking care of ourselves, taking care of yourselves as educators is very important. And it's probably the first thing that needs to be done before we can even start to think about how we can apply these principles in the classroom in an effective way. So we really encourage you to take some pauses before you consider applying any of these resources and think about, do a little temperature check on how you're doing, right? How are your problem solving skills or your coping skills, or how are we managing emotions recently, right? Do we need to use a little bit of extra support? Do we need to rely on supports? Do we need to seek some support ourselves to kind of navigate maybe some of our own trauma history before we can even think about kind of going and supporting our students as they're showing up in the classroom? And so keep in mind that with these suggestions and these recommendations that we're going to give, the purpose isn't for you to become the therapist in the classroom, right? There are professionals that kind of take that role in your schools, whether it's the school social worker or the school psychologist, the school counselor, or maybe like some mentors that are in the school. But we do believe in that by using some of these strategies and building them day to day in your classroom, you can start to kind of provide that support to all of your students, not just those who have experienced trauma, but to all of your students. And then through that, we'll be better able to tease out and find those students that may need that extra level of support, that more specialized intervention, such as individual therapy or group therapy. Next slide. All right, so the first big strategy that we're going to talk about is classroom rules. And I know that when we hear rules, it's not something pleasant. It's not something that we're like, yay, rules, right? But they aren't just there to be there, right? Rules serve a function. There's a purpose behind them. And so I want us to keep this image in mind. So you're driving down the expressway or the freeway and the speed limit is 65, right? But there's no traffic. And so you hit the gas and you're listening to your music and you're going and you're cruising along, and then you look at your speedometer and you're like, oh, it's at 80 right now. Then you glance over and you see a speed limit sign that's at 65, right? So chances are you're not going to hit the gas even further to try to hit 90, right? You're probably going to reassess, right? Look around, did any cops see me? No, okay, let me slow down a little bit, right? So you're checking yourself, right? And so rules are essentially, classroom rules can essentially serve the same function, right? So our rules, they're there to lay the expectations for our students. They're the foundation for how we would like the classroom to operate. They're going to help reduce those behaviors that are maybe disruptive in the classroom. And they're going to help provide our students with that predictability and that sense of security, right? When we're thinking of students that have gone through traumatic events such as domestic violence in the home or sexual abuse, or a mass shooting, unfortunately, we've been hearing about many cases of this in the news recently. It's important for them to be able to walk into a space and say, I know what to expect when I'm here, right? I know that when I walk into my classroom, this is what I need to do. And this is what my classmates are going to be expected to do as well, right? So our classroom rules aren't there to nag. They're there to provide that sense of security, that predictability, that hits on those trauma-informed principles that Professor Dana talked about. So we're going to go to the next slide. So a lot of times when we think of classroom rules, we can start naming them off in our head and think about all of these things that we want our classrooms to kind of follow and all of the speed checks that we want our students to have for themselves. But we just have some practical tips for how to make classroom rules maybe a little bit more effective in your classroom setting. And so what the experts have taught us about rules is that it's best to try to keep the number of rules to a minimum, right? If you all have looked at like state legislator like laws and stuff like that, it's pages upon pages upon pages, right? We're not going to have a PDF file, a 10-page PDF file up in our classroom of expectations that we have on our students. Think about your classroom. Think about what the most common presentation is for that age group, and consider what would be maybe the top 5, right? The top 5 things that you would really like to emphasize that can catch all for a lot of the behaviors that maybe you want to keep in check. So keeping the rules to a minimum, around 5 is a good recommended amount. Keeping the wording simple, again, keep that developmental lens in mind, right? You're not going to have big words. You're not going to maybe ask a kindergartner to be responsible. They might not really know what that means. They might not be able to read responsible yet, right? So we need to keep in mind the language that we're using when we are putting these roadmaps or these speed limits and these rules up in our classrooms. Have rules that have clear logical expectations for behavior. So we're probably not going to have rules on there that don't really fit for your classroom, that don't make sense for that age group that you're working with. So make sure that, again, we're keeping that developmental lens in mind of what's the most presenting behaviors that you see with your classroom that may be a little bit disruptive. The next one is really, really important, keeping the wording positive, right? If we have a list of rules and it says no running, no talking out of turn, no pushing each other, no cutting your hair, no writing on the walls, it's probably going to feel kind of icky for a student to walk into that space and see all of these no's, right? So avoid using that more negative language and try to keep the wording a little bit more positive. And I'm going to give you a few examples of that a little bit later on. Make the rule specific, so avoid that ambiguous language that can provide loopholes. I think this is especially important for our kids that are maybe a little bit older and are starting to use their critical thinking skills a little bit more and try to really find the loopholes. Well, you didn't specifically say this, like this doesn't really address this, right? And so trying to make them as specific as possible. Also making rules that describe behavior that is observable and measurable, right? We can't have a rule that says, don't think mean things about each other. We probably aren't going to be able to observe if our students are thinking mean things around each other, right? But we can have a rule that says, use kind language, right? So I can see that someone, I can quantify how many times someone says something that's hurtful versus sometimes that someone says something that is more encouraging. Right? And make the rules visible. Again, we're adults, we know what the speed limit is, but we still need to see those speed limit signs, right? And our brains are fully developed, right? So think about a kindergartner, think about a fifth grader, a high schooler, that they're still developing their brains. So having those visual reminders in your classroom is key to making rules be effective. Next slide. So just a few examples. I know a lot of times, these are big things that we want from our students, right? We want our kids to be responsible, we want them to be respectful, and we want them to be safe, right? But thinking about those tips that we talked about before, these are some examples of how maybe these rules can be tweaked a little bit to be more measurable, to be more specific, to be more maybe developmentally appropriate depending on your age group. So instead of saying be responsible, right, you can get into a debate with some people on what does that mean, right? What is responsible? What does responsible mean in a classroom? Remember that kids are learning how to be in a classroom as they're doing it. We're not born with that knowledge of what it means to be in a classroom, right? And so having instructions like follow directions the first time you are asked, right? Having that quantifiable first time in there. Be in your seat when the bell rings. That's observable. When the bell rings, I can see who's in the seat. Bring your materials to class and maybe listing some of those materials. Instead of just saying be respectful, we can ask them to raise their hand and ask permission to speak. So instead of saying don't speak out of turn, we're providing that prompt for what that desirable behavior is, right? We're wanting them to raise their hand. Listen to others, right? Instead of just saying be safe, right? I think that's a big one too, especially with kids that may be a little bit more jittery, right? Or a little bit more risk takers, some things that we might see unsafe, they might think this is just fun, right? So follow directions again, the first time you're asked, keep your hands and feet to yourself, walk when we're indoors, right? If we have that rule of no running, and you say that to a kindergartner, it's probably going to be really hard for them to keep that mentality of, okay, I'm outside and I can't run, right? So we want to be very clear with our rules. You can run outside in the playground. That's an okay place to run. But when we're indoors, we're going to walk. So keeping that developmental lens in mind. Next slide. So a big one, to be trauma informed in the classroom is to have those classroom rules and have them clear, have them developmentally appropriate, using that positive language. And going along with that, one of the biggest kind of takeaways, I think, for educators in providing trauma-informed teaching in the classroom is to keep this idea of positive reinforcement in mind. And so before we jump into positive reinforcement, that could be a whole week-long lecture series. So I'm just going to give you like a foundational description of it, and then we'll talk about it a little bit more. But I want us to keep this principle of behavior reciprocation in mind. So essentially what this means is that the behavior that we give out are the behaviors that we're likely to get back and in the same form, right? If I'm walking in the supermarket and I smile at someone, chances are they might smile at me, If I mean mug someone, they might mean mug me back, right? And so it's that principle of reciprocation, right? And so what we give out, we're likely to give back. So what that means when we're thinking about positive reinforcement, the more positives that we give, the more positive compliance we're likely to get in return. Next slide. And so something really important to keep in mind here, as educators, as adults, is that we really have to be mindful of our own behavior as we try to manage our students' behavior, right? So if our classroom is maybe being a little bit noisier or we're talking to a student and we tell them, don't raise your voice at me or lower your voice, and we're raising our voice, chances are that's just that. Keeping that principle of behavior reciprocation in mind, the response probably isn't going to be a quiet one, right? It's probably going to be a louder one, right? Their tone is probably going to be elevated. And so keep this principle in mind because this serves as the foundation of that positive reinforcement that we'll talk about in the next slide. So what is positive reinforcement? So when we say positive, I want you to think of adding something. And when we say negative, negative doesn't mean bad. It just means we're taking something away. That reinforcement piece means that we're increasing a behavior. So when we're saying positive reinforcement, we're doing something, us as the educators, we're doing something to increase a desirable behavior. So it occurs when something is presented after an appropriate behavior has been exhibited, and thus that behavior increases. So for example, after a student completes their reading assignment, they get a sticker. We're positively reinforcing that behavior of completing that assignment. Negative reinforcement, on the other hand, occurs when students engage in a behavior to avoid or escape something that the behavior increases. So for example, the student rushes to finish their work so they don't get kept in from recess to complete that work, right? So if they don't do the work, what's taken away is recess, right? And so that's negative reinforcement. What research shares with us is that in order to have more of that sustained long-term change towards that desirable behavior, reinforcement is actually a lot more effective than punishment. Right? But unfortunately, a lot of the systems that we work in kind of emphasize that punishment piece, right? So what is punishment? It occurs when something that the student does not like or wishes to avoid is applied after the behavior has occurred, resulting in a decrease in behavior. So for example, the students skip school and they're required to make up that missed time in an after-school detention. So keep in mind that a lot of our policies and a lot of maybe our rules are centered around this idea of punishment, but we encourage you to start to think about how we can shift that again to be more trauma informed, to have that reinforcement lens versus that punishment lens. So how do we use that positive reinforcement in the classroom? So I'll give you some examples of that in the next slide, but we have to keep in mind that when we are using positive reinforcers, these need to be age appropriate, right? So for kindergartners, a positive reinforcer may be a sticker, right? For a high schooler, maybe not so much, right? So they have to be age appropriate. We have to use reinforcers that are appropriate to the student's level of functioning, using the least amount of reinforcer that'll create that behavior change. So every time that a student completes an assignment, we're not going to have a pizza party for them, right? We're going to see what's the smallest step up of a reinforcer that I can use, right? Avoid using that partial praise. So we're going to talk about like positive praise in a little bit, but an example of that would be, we're reinforcing, oh, I'm really glad you finished your homework. The partial praise would be finally, or it's about time, right? That kind of defeats the purpose. It feels kind of gross when someone tells you adds that side comment on there, right? It might make the kid feel some shame, maybe some guilt, or maybe even some annoyance, or like, what's the point? You're just going to nag on me anyway. So it's not going to be very effective. For some reinforcers as well, it's important to elicit some of that parental and administrative support, right? I talked about using reinforcers that are kind of like a step up, but sometimes we can use reinforcers that are a little bit of a grander scale, right? So maybe having a pizza party or having a recess day or something like that for the students that you might need to get some support on other levels. And also making the most of opportunities to reinforce behavior. So something that's really important as well is that when we're using positive reinforcement in general, improvement should be reinforced, right? We shouldn't be expecting or waiting to give that reinforcement when the student's behavior is perfect, right? We're likely not going to get to perfection because we're human, right? No one's perfect. And so when you recognize those efforts that your students are engaging in to work towards that desired behavior, that's when that reinforcer can be really effective, because it's going to increase that motivation to keep working towards that. Next slide. So some examples of what positive reinforcement can look like in a classroom. And these, again, it's very a broad list that we have here. And I encourage you to, again, think through your classroom and think through what would be, you know, most beneficial for your students. But nonverbal cues such as a thumbs up or a smile. And thinking about our students that are coming from families or from communities or histories that have experienced a lot of trauma, think about, you know, has this kid received a smile today, right? Or did everyone in the house kind of wake up and did the arguing just start right away, you know? And so a nonverbal cue such as a smile, such as a thumbs up, such as like a pat on the back or something, that can be very powerful. And again, keeping in mind, or especially for our students that may have, that may be coming from backgrounds with higher levels of trauma. Providing verbal praise, right? So after a student does something desirable, you know, thank you for participating. That's an excellent question, right? Giving that verbal praise immediately, that's going to be a very powerful reinforcer as well. Giving some of those tangible rewards such as stickers or lollipops for participation. Activity rewards can also be helpful in a classroom, such as like the 5 minutes of free time at the end of the day. Having those group rewards like an end of the month ice cream party. But again, this is going to take you doing some creative thinking about your classroom, what resources are available to you. But remember that not all reinforcers have to be something big like a party, right? Again, that thumbs up, that smile, that great job, right? Great question. I see you're working really hard. That's going to move us towards that desirable behavior. And that's going to be emotionally corrective for our students that, you know, may be coming from a home where they're experiencing trauma, right? Whether it's the big T or the little t trauma. And so you can do a lot of positive impact. You don't have to do a full therapy session, right? But by giving some of this verbal praise or these nonverbal reinforcers, you're doing a lot of that corrective work for your students. Next slide. Okay. And lastly, another way to kind of apply these trauma-informed principles is by using positive teaching skills, right? And so this one's going to be a really big challenge. And I think this is not just, doesn't have to be just applied to teaching, but just to our day-to-day lives. But the first one, at least 4 positive statements for every 1 negative statement that we say. Right. And so this is a big challenge, right? Think about how many times we ask someone, don't do this, don't do that, or I don't like it when you do this, or that's wrong, right? And think about it just in our language, just in our day-to-day dialogue, how many times we focus more on those negative aspects, right? And I encourage you all to challenge yourself, give yourself a challenge for one day, right? To think, how can for every 1 negative I say, how can I counter it with 4 positive statements or actions, right? So can I tell someone, thank you for helping me, great job, I see you're trying really hard at that, or I can't, it's so hard, I can't even think of a 4th one, right? But thinking, you know, how can we counter those negative automatic kind of responses that we have with those 4 positive statements? And you're going to see that that's going to create a difference in your classroom. It's going to start to shift the culture in the classroom from one that's maybe one that I don't really want to be in because, you know, the teacher is upset at me, to one where students feel empowered, where they feel seen, right? Where they feel like they're important. Build those positive relationships with students. This can be done by greeting students in the morning, you know. Again, going back to our students that unfortunately are coming from home environments that maybe aren't the safest. Did they get a good morning that day? Did they get a, I'm so happy to see you today? We don't know. And chances are that for some of our students, they didn't get that, right? And so you can be that one person to provide that corrective emotional experience for them and counter and buffer against some of those impacts of trauma. Show some sincere interest in the students and their work and their preferences and their activities. If they have hobbies that they're interested in, ask them about their hobbies, ask them about their extracurricular activities. Let students know that you want to help them when they have trouble with assignments or with tasks, but start to build those positive relationships by showing that true engagement and interest in your students as people, right? Another way of building that positive teaching environment that's going to be emotionally corrective for our students is by giving that accurate, specific, and descriptive feedback. So acknowledge their efforts, acknowledge that you see that they're trying, right? Instead of telling a student, oh, you missed 4 days this week, one more and it's a detention, let them know, I'm really glad that you're here today, right? I'm really glad that you showed up. Right? And just think about how just that shift in our language, it's going to reinforce, it's going to move them towards that desired behavior of, oh, this is somewhere where I'm seen. This is somewhere where I'm important, right? And that's going to lead them to want to show up versus not show up. Be brief with feedback. So we don't need to give, these essays of feedback or this whole speech of how much we appreciate our students. Again, it can just be, I'm happy to see you. I see that you're trying. It can be as brief as that. Like we talked about before, explaining the rules and the expectations ahead of time, right? Again, our students don't know the expectations of being in a classroom because they're just learning that, right? As employees, we get a week orientation before you start a job, right? Students don't get that. They're kind of learning as they go. And so keep that in mind that you're socializing them into what it's like to be in a classroom. So having that consistency along. Regularly communicate with parents about the positive things their students do. On the clinical side, we see kids here at the clinic and we ask, how's your relationship we ask the parents, how's their relationship with the school? And a lot of times they'll say, oh, if there's some behavioral concerns, every time they call, I know something bad happened. What's wrong? Can we imagine how much of a difference it would be if we noticed that, little Timmy was helping out a classmate, who was struggling with an art assignment? And if we shared that feedback with parents, what that would do to the culture in the home, right? The parents are going to maybe say, oh, I got this call from your teacher. You're doing really great. That made me really happy. Thank you. That's going to reinforce that behavior, right? On multiple levels. So we encourage you as teachers to give yourself that challenge of, we know it's extra work, but it can, the impacts of that can be very, very big. And using that proximity praise as the final kind of tip on there. And so proximity praise is kind of catching students doing good or doing things that are desirable and praising that immediately, right? And our hope is that, for example, if student A has a mild behavior concern and the student that sits maybe close to them is doing the desired behavior, praise it, catch it right away. Kids are watching, right? And they'll be like, oh, I want my teacher to tell me that, or I want a sticker too. Let me try to start to shift my behavior, right? And so praising that behavior as soon as you see it is really, really effective. And so we do have some resources. I know this is a lot of information, and we can tease apart a lot of this information a lot more extensively, but these are some resources that we found really helpful in kind of using this trauma-informed lens and applying it to the classroom. So we'll keep those up there for you all to kind of jot down. But these are some resource books for teachers, also some websites that have really good information packets to better understand trauma, to better understand the impacts of trauma. The National Child Traumatic Stress Network has like information packets for parents and for educators that can be really helpful as well for you to continue kind of digging into this topic. Dr. Paul.
All right, thank you, everyone. This is a great quote to end on by Brene Brown and Dare to Lead. Teachers, we can't always ask our students to take off the armor at home or even on their way to school because their emotional and physical safety may require self-protection. But what we can do is create a space in our schools and classrooms where all students can walk in and for that day or hour, take off the crushing weight of their armor, hang it on the rack, and open their hearts to truly being seen. We should never underestimate the benefit to a child of having a place to belong. It can and often does change the trajectory of their life. I think what's fascinating about the presentation today is that many of these best practices that you are hearing today are probably ones you have heard before and didn't maybe realize that they actually are trauma informed. They are the interventions, the methods, the cultures that are emotionally corrective and how impactful they can be. So when we put them we sort of repackage them through these lenses, I imagine many of you are already doing a lot of these things. So keep doing them and recognize that there's nothing magical about being trauma informed. It's a lot of best practices repackaged in a new way, reorganized in a new way. And that's why they matter so much. So we have some time now for questions. I don't have any questions in the Q&A, but if anybody has something they'd like to raise, please feel free to raise your hand and we'll allow you to ask your question. Challenge this team to help you.
Yes, hi. Thank you
Hi.
again for your information. I just have a question as to your clinic. How do you refer to your clinic or how does that work?
That's a great question. We're really excited because we just opened a new satellite clinic for all of our youth and family services in the center of town near UMC, within a couple of minutes walking distance from UMC. So at Charleston and Rancho Drive. And you give families the information and they can just call themselves. They don't need a referral from insurance or a pediatrician. They can just give us a call, and we'll let them know what our clinic is about and how the process works. We typically have somebody, we have them come in for an intake first, which is about an hour-long appointment to get a sense of what's going on for them and how we can be helpful. And then we round on that person's information that week and then just make a recommendation for one of our groups or individual therapy or even psychological assessment and testing if that's warranted. Did that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, sure. I promise we will always answer the phone. We will always call people back. And if we don't have resource, if we're not a good fit for someone, we will do service coordination and help them, give them other referrals we'll work with them to see what other referrals might be appropriate. I know in this community, I've heard many, many stories of people not even getting a call back. And that will not happen at my clinic. Our clinic, and if it does happen, you let us know and we'll fix it. We have a couple of so maybe it would be helpful for people to hear about our groups. We have a new group. Dr. Miranda, do you want to talk about that real fast?
Absolutely. Yes. Actually, I'm very excited. We are starting a new substance use disorder adolescent group. That's starting officially next week, Wednesdays from 4 to 5:15, and so in that group it caters to young adults who may need some support with substance use behaviors. So I will actually be co-facilitating that with another student counselor here. And so using with my licensed addiction background, we'll be able to attend to also perhaps some of the co-occurring conditions that are also related to the substance use. So please spread the word, because right now our group consists of 2 and we want more than 2. So we're happy to send you flyers and just really get this group going. Awesome. Thank you, Diana. And then I'll just...
I was gonna reiterate that in terms of cost, we slide from $35 down to $5 a session, and our groups are always $5 a session, paid in $20 increments. So we're trying to keep our costs low, and hopefully by fall we'll be able to bill Medicaid. Definitely Medicaid fee for service. We're working on the other MCOs. And the other groups.
Yeah, the other groups. I'll pass the baton to Professor Enya.
I can talk about them too. We have so we have 2 teen groups currently right now. We have a Monday night teen group and we have a Tuesday night teen group as well. So these are skills building groups, generally for like older teens and younger teens that we've kind of split the groups up into. But there the kids will learn coping skills to kind of address school stress, family dynamics, anxiety, depression, but also just a lot of the developmental milestones that teens face. So we talk about identity development, we talk about being our authentic selves, and it's a really, really great space for teens, and the teens that we have in the group have just blossomed from receiving that service. So we have 2 teen groups available, and then we also have social emotional learning group for kids roughly ages 9 to 12. And that's our B Kids Thursday afternoon group. And that's where kids learn all about emotions, learn about how to talk about emotions, how to identify emotions in their body, how to cope with emotions, whether that emotion is anger, sadness, joy, kind of how we navigate and how we express these emotions in a healthy way. And so that's a really fun group as well. And that's on Thursday afternoons.
And all in person at this point.
Yes, yeah, we're all in person. One other thing I want to share that we're really proud of is our trauma-focused intervention program. So we are working to become a specialty clinic in what's called TFCBT, Trauma-Focused Cognitive Behavior Therapy, and we're doing that in partnership with a national initiative with, I think it's 10 sites nationally. I think they're going to grow to 18, working with St. John's University in Queens, New York. But the bottom line is, if you have kids that you are seeing exhibiting signs of trauma, or know that there's a trauma and they're really struggling and the interventions at home and school aren't working, please think of us. So we would be more than pleased to welcome them into our space and provide the more intensive individual therapy that sometimes is called for when kids and families are struggling to move past and move through a traumatic experience. So we have about 5 minutes left. Are there any other questions? Lydia again. Go ahead and unmute yourself, Lydia.
Thank you again. As a special education teacher, it's very interesting that pretty much all the little T's and the big T's have been covered in class. So I was hoping that perhaps this could actually, be, if it's possible to maybe address special education with all these trauma little factors that we could help out, because this is pretty much the norm for them. And so we need to be, like you said, we have to place that lens, that extra lens to go further and try to help best, because like you said, this is pretty much the norm, and we need to really a little deeper and help. And that leads to the question about, is it possible, to have them be referred to you guys, and that's also, like a resource for them as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what you were saying was, you see that working in the special education space, this is not news to you, and probably more likely than not, the little t's, or the accumulation of chronic invalidation or ostracization, or right, or marginalization, can manifest in terms of needing that emotionally responsive, attuned culture that helps to counteract the effects of the little t's. And and when it's time to refer to specialized care, that's what we're here for at our clinic. We're passionate about making a dent in this mental health crisis in Nevada, and we hope that one day we won't have to wait on long wait lists for mental health providers. And also, people like you that attend seminars like this are gonna, we're happy to give away this knowledge, right? Give it away and have you take it and do with it what you will in the spaces that you have influence over, because that's going to be the way in which we really tackle the mental health crisis, is if we're all working together. Did I answer your question, Lydia? Were you, yeah. Yeah.
Can you hear me? I'm sorry.
Yeah.
You did address the question. Thank you. It also, with the current times, I think we kind of didn't really kind of talk about this. One of the T's, the external T's, as you mentioned, is that now with COVID and stuff, we've seen a lot of death. So I think it's important to kind of address these kinds of things with children. Some children have lost both their parents or grandparents, and how do we address this with them? How can we help them? Are there some tips or resources that we could dig into and be better sources for our students in this time frame? Or
right. We've all endured a collective trauma with the pandemic, and absolutely there are a number of us who have lost loved ones, and our children, of course our children, and many of them several people in a family. So we've had some so let's talk about some grief resources in this team. Certainly the National Child Traumatic Stress Network offers grief resources. Are you familiar with Adam's Place?
Yes, thank you.
That's another great resource in town that offers information.
I think something that I wanted to add to that is kind of, I think with Professor Irena had mentioned it, kind of we're modeling to our kids also how to kind of navigate through these situations. And so being that is, with COVID, with a lot of, just stuff that's gone on socially, right, in the last few years, really being mindful of how as adults we're navigating through the situations, because that's how our kids are looking to see how do they navigate through it, right? What's a healthy way to navigate through losing, multiple family members from COVID. And so modeling that I think is really important, but then also demonstrating that it's okay to talk about these things, like we talked about with having a check-in, right? Just noting like, hey, a lot of stuff has been going on. How are we all feeling? So just normalizing that we can talk about these things. Kids can talk about their feelings with adults. And then as that communication starts to happen, our hope is that we'll be able to find those kids that need that extra support, whether it's through therapy, through group therapy. And so I think just starting that conversation is the biggest thing that we can do and not tiptoe around it.
I was just going to say, in response to her question, I would also say if you are an educator within the school, hopefully, you have a school, you have a school counselor or a school social worker. And I would say just be vigilant of your students and things like that, because I know there may be a lot of, small socially and emotional groups that can help with them. Like they may have make like a grief group or just something like that. Those two, just utilizing your own staff, teamwork and all that kind of stuff.
Right. It's a great idea because you know your school best, you know your kids best, and it may be that a group of kids, you are very well aware that they've all lost someone, and it may be an opportunity to pull them together for that peer support so they can speak to, they can work together. We have a grief curriculum here at UNLV Practice that we'd be happy to provide some information about if people wanted to reach out to us, on the back channel, and we could talk about that curriculum with people. All right. Well, we're at the end of our time. Thank you all for hanging in there on a Wednesday afternoon in the middle of your summer. We really appreciate seeing your names in our participant box, and spread the word about what we do, and we appreciate you.